Okay, just to introduce myself, I'm Aidan Dodson. I'm the Professor of Egyptology at Bristol University, and have interest apart from in my sort of course subject. I've always been fascinated by early engineering, and in fact I have a sideline in naval history as well. So, but anyway, what I wanted to do today is to talk about the context of the original design of the suspension bridge in its Egyptianizing form, looking at the models which were adopted and also how that use of an Egyptianizing approach fits in with the architectural history of the earlier part of the 19th century. To really just to kick off, I suppose, it's worthwhile just sort of reminding people of some of the other kinds of inspiration which were adopted for various proposed earlier bridges. For example, William Bridges' amazing structure from 1793, which one would love to know whether it would actually have worked or not. But then moving on to the actual original competition in 1829, that's the invitation to tender, which sort of kicked the whole process off, and just a few of the, some cases potentially rather beautiful possible options, although I think probably most people would agree that what we ended up with was actually the better of all of these things. Here's just a few of those original ideas. This amazing neoclassical example there. The rather sort of rustic version at the top there. And then we come to some of Brunel's initial ideas, which of course actually had a variety of options before finally the decision was made to go with the Thomas Telford's Gothic fantasy. But eventually this is the Brunel design, at least the initial iteration of that. Many things changed on as the design developed, but here we can see that initial Egyptianizing shaping of the towers, which I'll sort of follow up in a bit more detail shortly. Then we move to the my more mature version, which is really a much more heavily ornamented version of the original. The overall shape is something, say, I'll be following on in a moment. Let's have a look at a couple of details of it. For example, we note which I'll again follow on. There's sort of these Sphinxes on top and this winged sun disk. But as far as the overall shape is concerned, contemporary records talk about it being an Egyptian gateway, examples of which are found in Tentera. Tentera is the early 19th century way of referring to the site of Dandara. And it is a temple pretty late in date as far as ancient Egypt is concerned. Ancient Egypt kicks off in 3000 BC, and by the time this temple was built to the goddess of femininity, a lady called Hathor, we're talking very late. Egypt is no longer an independent state and has now been absorbed into the Roman Empire. And in fact, all the models which were being used for Egyptianizing an architecture in the early 19th century, including Brunel's work here, are really derived from these much later, late first, early second century things. But it appears that this is the model, is this the gateway at the very entrance to the complex, rather than the actual temple itself, whereby you have individual doorways, but I can't see anything about the temple itself being what you'd be sort of using as your model. However, say the entrance to the overall enclosure is, although quite badly damaged, is that basic shape. And we can see a rather better preserved one here at Karnak, slightly earlier. But again, all of these particular kinds of gateways date to the latter years of ancient Egypt, 3rd century through to the early part of the years AD. And what we can see here are the principal elements of an Egyptian gateway, with this cavetto cornice here, which is with the splaying out here from the main level out to the top, and also the cavetto cornice, which is this round, sorry, this torus moulding, which is this rounded piece running along there. And as you can see, these examples are all covered in reliefs of the king, basically, or in this case, the king in front of various Egyptian gods. So that's the kind of thing which Brunel had in mind when he created the original design for the bridge. And so we end up with this. The things which are immediately visible here are this winged sun disk, which is a very typical Egyptian motif. And in fact, if we just pop back to that, we can see that motif here, there. The idea of the sun being shown as a winged entity, because in Egyptian religious belief, the sun has a number of different gods attached to it, and the midday sun, for example, is a falcon who carries the sun on his back, and therefore the idea of the sun being supported by wings goes way back in Egyptian iconography. Also, we have on the top of the bridge are a pair of sphinxes. The use of sphinxes in British Egyptianizing architecture during the 19th century is fairly common. The Sphinx itself being an archetypal Egyptian thing, and the very fact that we also find it in this painting of the Egyptianizing design. And as we go here, we can actually see the Sphinxes here, but from a side view. Interesting to see that on the previous images, the Sphinxes are shown facing outwards to the person who is coming onto the bridge, but then the version of the design which this painting is based upon, you see they are facing in the other direction. So that rather than actually looking into them as you approach the bridge, you're looking at their back sides. And there's a similar kind of debate took place when Cleopatra's Needle was being erected a few years later in London. It has a couple of bronze sphinxes either side of it, and there was a big debate as to whether they should be facing into the obelisk or the other way round. They ended up again with their back sides facing towards any approaching person. So it'll be interesting to know which way round ultimately would have been done had they actually completed the bridge to the originally planned design. So the Sphinx is an archetypally Egyptian thing. It goes back to the earliest years of Egyptian civilization, and the basic idea is it's a combination of the king and the lion. The lion being regarded as being emblematic of physical power, and therefore having a king in the form of a lion like this is absolutely common. And this is a very fine example on the embankment of the River Neva at St. Petersburg. This is 1,000 years earlier than the kinds of archetypes which we've been looking at so far, but is something which runs all the way through Egyptian usage. And the idea of having a pair of sphinxes on top of a monument you find quite widely spread around Europe during the 19th century. And here's a nice couple of examples on the Royal School of Arts in Edinburgh. Although these are rather less accurate sphinxes, the trouble is that in classical mythology, the Sphinx is actually a female. And if you think about the story of Oedipus and stuff, so you often end up with some rather sort of some Sphinxes of rather uncertain sexuality, shall we say, or gender, when you look at some of the ones which are created during the 19th century. And so if they had actually completed the bridge to its original design, one wonders what sort of Sphinxes we'd actually have had, as well as which way round they'd be facing the approaching visitor. Now, why was the idea of making the bridge Egyptianizing? Where did that whole thing come from? Well, the early part of the 19th century saw one of the first upsurges, what we tend to call Egyptomania. There have been other episodes during the 1920s after the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun. There were also upsurges in it. But basically the idea that ancient Egypt suddenly comes into focus, and there is a popular sort of demand for the use of it. Also, the use of Egyptianizing architecture was also something of a reaction against the whole classical, neoclassical, Gothic kind of arguments about architecture. It brought a new player into the whole thing, over and above classicism and also say Gothic architecture. The reason why Egypt became in people's faces during the early 19th century is largely owing to Napoleon Bonaparte's expedition to Egypt in 1798, which not only was a military activity aimed at interfering with the British route out to India, but also included a large scientific element. So there was a huge along with the French army, there was also an army of academics, and as a result, they produced a number of works. There was an official one, which I'll come to in a second, but while the whole campaign was still going on, a man called Vivant Denon, who later became the director of the Louvre, had been part of the expedition, but he came back slightly earlier, and he then produced this work, which became a bestseller, originally in French, but even though at the time Britain and France were at war, an English translation was produced, and pretty rapidly this became the great work which brought Egypt in front of people probably for the first time. And that's the title page, and also here we've got his drawing of the Dindara temple, which I showed in the earlier photograph, and also a close-up of one of the interior doorways of the temple. As you sort of go in, the next sort of big wall has this doorway in it. And again, you can see it's that classical shape of an Egyptian gateway, although in this case, it's actually embedded in the wall. And this possibly is the image which was in the mind when that quotation I put up on the earlier slide came along. Also, a much larger and far more expensive official version was produced, Description de l'Egypte, but together Denon's work and the Description meant that by the time we're into the 1820s and 30s, Egyptian architecture is really quite very much in people's faces. And as a result, during that period, a number of public buildings had already been built in that. Most famously, there's the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly, built in 1812, unfortunately now long since demolished in 1905, although interestingly, the Egyptian Tourist Office is in the building which is now on the site in question. And not only was it in Egyptian design, in the early 1820s, an exhibition of material from Egypt produced by Giovanni Belzoni was displayed here, including a 1/6 scale model of an Egyptian king's tomb, the remains of which are now in Bristol Museum. So there's quite a bit of a Bristolian link with this structure. Also, here now in the southwest, we've got this being used. Here in Devonport, we have this rather nice juxtaposition, particularly on the, as it was back in the early 19th century, juxtaposition of classical architecture, Gothic architecture, and Egyptian style architecture, all in this area. Although this Gothic structure, it's a church, is now long gone. But here we still see that juxtaposition of these two styles of architecture. And there we have it today. It was originally the Naval and Military Library, and then ended up as the Oddfellows Hall. Fairly debased Egyptian architecture, but still you can see that again, that basic shape of a gateway as the window frames here, exactly as we find at the bridge. And then another thing in the southwest, the Egyptian house in Penzance, effectively roughly the same sort of date as the Egyptian design of the bridge, which actually is now a landmark trust property, and you can actually stay there. You can actually rent a flat in it. So with all that in the background, and also the fact that, of course, that pylon shape is pretty well the standard shape of a tower of a suspension bridge anyway. So I think that's sort of this combination of Egypt being one of the sort of en vogue things to do as far as architecture is concerned, and also the fact it's fitted beautifully with the technical requirements of a suspension bridge tower. All those seem to have combined to make this that. One of the things which can't be seen on this particular drawing is it appears that in addition to simply having the architectural shape, there was a plan at one point at least to have metal panelling with Egyptianizing reliefs actually in it. Although I've not managed to come across anything which explains exactly what those would have been. Would it have been Isambard Kingdom Brunel dressed as a pharaoh making offerings to... the mind boggles. Sadly, of course, then they ran out of money. And when that point came along, all that had been erected were the towers. Looking at them as they were constructed, there clearly was an intent that it wasn't going to be quite the same, because as we can see here, we've got lower arch and then the sort of smaller one up there, which wouldn't really quite fit in with how all that was. So it looks as though there was some kind of what would have been produced even before the money ran out would not have been quite exactly as per the original design here. But then after suspension, of course, by the time things got going again in the 1860s, it was a question of finishing the whole thing off at the most economic price. And also Egyptomania was long gone. And therefore we have effectively the core which was produced, but still to the initiated, one can see where it was coming from. But also we do have things which were completed to the full Egyptianizing design, which are the toll houses, which are intact at the Somerset end, but of course sadly the Clifton end ones were demolished to make way for the ones which had recently been replaced by something slightly less sort of 60s in appearance. But so in spite of the fact that the main towers were never completed to their Egyptian design, the approaches with the toll houses were indeed completed to that original intention. And also it's not only the towers where one can see the remains of that Egyptian intention. If we look here, and this works at both ends, look closely at the abutments and zoom in. Here again, we can see by no means as obvious as the full Egyptianizing plan of the towers would have been, but here we can again see that cavetto cornice and then cutting in here, so that even with the functional abutments, that Egyptianizing idea is still to be seen. And so there we have it, the Dendara approach with its gateway, with the towers of the bridge superimposed, and our little bit of Egypt on Avon. Thank you.